Coronation Park, Delhi, December 12, 1911. Under a burning Indian sun, 500,000 people pressed together in a vast field of dust and color. Silk banners snap in the wind, jewels flash like fire, and the air hums with the roar of drums, trumpets, and human voices. At the center of it all, on a raised platform draped in imperial red, stand a man and a woman who rule an empire on which the sun supposedly never sets. He is King Emperor George V. She is Queen Mary of Teck. As the princes of India bow before them, and the crowd thunders its approval, few realize that the quiet woman at his side will be the one to hold the royal family together through war, scandal, and the slow death of empire. Fewer still know that behind her calm expression is a mind sharper than most ministers, and a will strong enough to remake the image of the British monarchy itself. How did a girl born into a cash-strapped branch of the royal family end up here, at the heart of global power? And how did she help build the modern House of Windsor that still exists today? We're about to pull back the curtain on the real Queen Mary. Dutiful wife, iron-willed mother, obsessive collector, and the woman who quietly steered the monarchy through its most dangerous years. Before we step into her story, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Ancient Exposé. This is where we dive deep into the people who shaped history in ways the headlines never told you, so you don't miss the next story that changes how you see the past. Now let's go back to where it all began. Mary of Teck entered the world on May 26, 1867. In a place already soaked in royal history, Kensington Palace in London. It was the very same room where Queen Victoria had been born 48 years earlier. From the very beginning, Mary's life was wrapped in tradition and expectation, but not in the way you might think. Her full baptismal name was a mouthful: Victoria Mary. Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes. Family and friends shortened it to May, a nickname that stuck with her for the rest of her life. To the world, she would later be Queen Mary, but to those closest to her, she was simply May, a shy girl with a book in her hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. On paper, her family looked impressive. Her father, Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, came from the German nobility of Württemberg. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, was a granddaughter of King George III. That made young May a great-granddaughter of a king and a cousin of the reigning monarch, Queen Victoria herself. Royal blood seemed to flow from every direction, so that meant easy money and a life of luxury, right? Not exactly. Despite their grand titles, the Tecks were constantly short of cash. Her father hadn't brought a huge fortune from his German lands, and although Parliament gave her mother an income, the family's royal status meant they were expected to live like royals, with big houses, staff, and endless social obligations. They spent more than they had, over and over. Mary learned early what it meant to look rich but feel poor. While her cousins at court might have seemed to float through life, Mary's parents cut corners on her education and upbringing where they could. Her governess, an Alsatian woman named Helene Bricke, became one of the steady emotional anchors of her childhood. From her mother, Mary absorbed something even more important than languages and manners, a deep sense of duty toward the poor and those who lived far outside palace walls. But the world outside those palace walls was changing in ways no royal could ignore. When Mary was born, Britain was already in the late stages of the Industrial Revolution. Cities had exploded in size, railways sliced through the countryside, factories belched smoke over neighborhoods where workers lived hard, short lives. Gas lamps lit London's streets. Photographs and telegrams were shrinking distance and time. By the time Mary was a young woman, electricity, cameras, telegraphs, and soon automobiles and radio were transforming daily life. The United Kingdom itself was changing too, from an elite-dominated system where only wealthy men voted, into a more democratic society, edging toward universal suffrage. The royal family could no longer simply rule from above. They had to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant, or overthrown. Mary didn't know it yet, but she would become one of the key architects of that adaptation. As a teenager, she spent time in Florence, Italy, where she soaked up art, architecture, and history. She learned Italian, French, and German, and developed a serious interest in art and culture. At court, people saw her as quiet, serious, and more interested in books than in social games, but kind, observant, and grounded. There was just one problem. What do you do with a young woman who is royal enough not to marry a commoner, but not quite royal enough to be an obvious match for a major heir? In the 19th century royal world, marriage wasn't just about romance. It was about alliances, image, and duty. For Mary, the plan seemed simple. She'd probably marry a minor prince or a second son somewhere in Europe and disappear into the background as a duchess in some other country. But Queen Victoria had other plans. Victoria, who had ruled since 1837, saw something in Mary: steadiness, intelligence, and a moral backbone that might balance out a troubled grandson, Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the future Edward VII and heir after him. Albert Victor was handsome, charming, and a problem. He resisted marriage, ignored rules, and got himself caught up in scandals, including rumors linking him to a notorious male brothel on Cleveland Street. Later, some wild theories even tried to cast him as Jack the Ripper, though there's no real proof for that. Still, his reputation worried the court. Victoria hoped Mary could calm him down, give him purpose, and steady the future of the monarchy. The match was arranged. The path looked set. Then everything shattered. In January 1892, before they could marry, Albert Victor fell ill during a flu pandemic and died of pneumonia. He was just 28. Mary was devastated. She had grown emotionally attached to the idea of the life she was supposed to have, and now that future had vanished overnight. What happens to a woman whose destiny is tied to a man who never makes it to the altar? In Mary's case, the answer was unexpected and history-changing. After Albert Victor's death, the line of succession shifted to his younger brother, Prince George. George was no romantic hero. He was serious, dutiful, and more comfortable in a naval uniform than in glittering balls. He had fallen in love with a woman far below his station, Julie Stonor, only to be told flatly that as second in line to the throne, a commoner was off limits. So, with duty winning out over desire, the solution was simple and cold. If Mary had been good enough for Albert Victor, she was good enough for George. In July 1893, Mary married George at St. James's Palace. It wasn't a love story from a fairy tale, but it wasn't a disaster either. George could be stiff, formal, and emotionally distant. He often expressed affection more easily in letters than face-to-face. Mary would gently write back that it was lovely to read his kind words, but that she wouldn't mind hearing them out loud occasionally. Yet in their own way, they grew into a partnership built on shared duty. They raised 6 children: Edward, the future Edward VIII, born 1894, Albert, the future George VI, born 1895, Mary, their only daughter, born 1897, Henry, born 1900, George, born 1902, John, born 1905, whose fragile health would become a painful family wound. At their homes, York Cottage at Sandringham and York House in London, George ruled the household almost like a naval officer, strict and disciplinarian. Physical punishment was common at the time, but visitors felt the atmosphere was unusually harsh. Household staff could even discipline the children physically, something that raised eyebrows even in that era. In this stern environment, Mary became the emotional buffer. The children often ran to her for comfort when their father's temper or rules became too much. She wasn't a modern mother by today's standards, but compared to George, she was warmth and mercy. Still, there were some heartbreaks no parent could soften. Their youngest son, Prince John, developed epilepsy as a small boy. In a world that barely understood the condition, John was increasingly shielded from public view. He didn't attend the grand coronation of his parents in 1911. While London celebrated, John remained at Sandringham, away from cameras and crowds that could trigger seizures. By 1913, he was almost never seen in public. In 1919, his epilepsy worsened, and he died at just 13 years old after a severe seizure. Later generations would criticize George and Mary for hiding him, but the truth was more complicated. They were living in a time when medical knowledge was limited and public life could be brutal. Keeping John away from official events wasn't just about image. It may also have been an attempt to protect him. Through all of this, life didn't slow down. Mary and George traveled throughout the empire, a grand tour in 1901 that took them to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, a trip to India in 1905, visits to European courts. Then in 1901, the world shifted again. Queen Victoria died, ending the longest reign in British history up to that point. Her son became King Edward VII, and George stepped into the role of heir apparent. Mary, once a financially struggling cousin in a side branch of the royal tree, was now destined to be queen. Edward VII's health was never strong. Years of smoking, overeating, and indulgence caught up with him. In May 1910, he died at 68. George became King George V. Mary became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and Empress of India. Though her first given name was Victoria, she chose to reign as Queen Mary, both to distinguish herself and out of respect for Queen Victoria's monumental legacy. Their coronation in June 1911 was lavish and traditional, but the world they ruled was anything but calm. Britain was in the middle of a constitutional crisis over taxes and social reform. Europe was bristling with rivalries, arms races, and colonial tensions. And then came that second coronation moment, this time in India, at the Delhi Durbar later that year. The Durbar was meant to show imperial strength and unity. Maharajas and princes gathered in dazzling jewels and silks. British officials lined up in stiff uniforms. George and Mary appeared as the living symbols of an empire that stretched across continents. The following day, they stood on the balcony of the Red Fort, waving to a sea of faces, 500,000 people watching the new Emperor and Empress of India. For Mary, it was more than a spectacle. It was a reminder that the monarchy's power rested less and less on actual rule, and more on performance, image, and connection. That realization would shape how she approached her role for the rest of her life. Back in Britain, Mary and George ruled as a team in a way the previous king and queen hadn't. Edward VII and Queen Alexandra had often done their own thing separately. George, reserved and sometimes socially awkward, leaned heavily on Mary's intelligence and instincts. Mary pushed him to look beyond court gossip and elite circles, encouraging visits to poor neighborhoods, hospitals, and coal mines, like the 1912 visit to South Wales during a massive miners' strike. The image of a king and queen walking through the grimy world of industrial labor helped reshape how the public saw the monarchy. At the same time, Mary drew a firm line when it came to militant suffragettes. She witnessed the shocking moment in 1913 when activist Emily Davison stepped onto the racetrack at the Epsom Derby and was struck and fatally injured by the king's horse. To many, Davison became a martyr, but to Mary, actions like that felt dangerous and chaotic, a step too far, even if the cause itself would one day prevail. Then, in 1914, everything exploded. World War I crashed down over Europe like a storm. For Mary, the conflict was more than a geopolitical disaster. It was a family nightmare. Her husband George was first cousin to Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II and to Russia's Tsar Nicholas II. Royal cousins found themselves on opposite sides of a war fueled by nationalism, alliances, and old rivalries. Mary threw herself into war work with ruthless discipline. She saw it as her duty not just to appear busy, but to actually help. Early in the war, she wrote about the need to support soldiers' families and hospital efforts. She took charge of the newly renamed Queen Mary's Needlework Guild, coordinating thousands of women who knitted socks, scarves, and garments for troops and the wounded. At St. James's Palace, visitors saw mountains of packages ready to go out to the front. Mary visited hospitals, encouraged women to take on new roles at home while men were at war, and quietly pushed the royal household to cut its own luxuries. She insisted that the royal family practice rationing and frugality. If ordinary British families were sending their sons to die in the trenches, she believed, the royals had no right to live as though nothing had changed. After the war, the country wanted to thank her in a way as unusual as her wartime service. The result was Queen Mary's doll's house. But this was no children's toy. Designed by star architect Edwin Lutyens and built at a scale of 1 inch to 1 foot. It was a miniature Edwardian mansion filled with astonishing detail. Tiny working lights, miniature books containing real, handwritten pages by famous authors, tiny paintings commissioned from real artists, microscopic cutlery, even a wine cellar with real drops of alcohol inside the bottles. It was a tribute not just to Mary, but to the world she helped keep stable through the chaos of war. Today, it still sits in Windsor Castle, like a frozen snapshot of an empire that no longer exists. Yet while the doll's house captured an idealized world, the real one outside was far less secure. Across Europe, monarchies were falling. Russia's Romanovs were overthrown and murdered in the Revolution. The Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary lost their empire. Germany's Kaiser went into exile. Portugal's monarchy was gone. Spain's would soon follow. In Britain, the monarchy survived, but not by accident. Mary and George doubled down on public engagement in the 1920s. At Buckingham Palace, George kept a chart tracking their public work. Mary focused on hospitals, children's welfare, and projects aimed at improving working-class living conditions. The goal was clear. The royal family must be seen, not as remote rulers, but as servants of the people's welfare. Amazingly, it worked. By the end of George VI's reign, the monarchy was more popular than when he had taken the throne, an almost unheard-of achievement. Mary's careful guidance had paid off. Behind the scenes, though, her family life was far from stable. Her second son, Albert, was dutiful and serious, working hard to overcome a painful speech impediment that made public speaking a nightmare. Her daughter, Princess Mary, was responsible and active in public life, but her other sons caused headaches. Henry began a scandalous affair tied to hard partying nights. George, Duke of Kent, was rumored to have fathered a child out of wedlock. And then there was Edward, the eldest, the Prince of Wales, the heir, the man who would one day be king. Edward loved parties, travel, and glamorous company. He pushed off marriage, decade after decade, frustrating his parents and alarming courtiers who knew the dynasty needed a secure line of succession. Mary's way of dealing with his romantic life was silence. She never confronted him directly about his relationships or his refusal to marry. Instead, she watched from a distance as he drifted further from the sense of duty she held so sacred. Meanwhile, she found escape and purpose in collecting art and objects. Mary became a force behind the royal collection, adding portraits, paintings, jade pieces from the Far East, and famous Fabergé works, often themed around birds. She wasn't always praised for her artistic taste. She preferred quantity to masterpiece quality, but she tirelessly worked to organize and expand the collection. Over time, rumors grew that she was more than just an enthusiastic collector, that she sometimes hinted strongly that objects she admired in other people's homes should be gifted to her. Some modern portrayals have painted her almost as a kleptomaniac queen, pocketing items from aristocratic houses. The truth is more nuanced. Royals had long been given gifts by hosts, hoping to win favor, and these gifts were often repaid with patronage. Many items Mary acquired went into the royal collection, not her personal stash, effectively held in trust for the nation. Still, her intense desire to collect, and her blindness to how it sometimes looked, would later color how history judged her. As she was quietly rearranging antiques, her husband's health was falling apart. George Fee's body had been worn down by chain smoking, stress, and a fall from a horse during a troop review in World War I. By the late 1920s, he was frequently sick, exhausted, and confined to bed for long stretches. Mary dealt with it the way she dealt with most things, with stoic self-control. She showed little emotion publicly, pushing forward with her duties, even as she worried privately about their troubled heir. In 1935, George and Mary celebrated his Silver Jubilee, 25 years on the throne. It was a carefully staged moment of national unity during hard times, and once again, the public saw a steady, reliable royal couple. Privately, everyone knew George wouldn't live to see a golden jubilee at 50 years. He died on January 20th, 1936. Later, it emerged that his doctor had hastened his death with a lethal injection of drugs, so the news would make the more respectable morning papers, a decision that still sparks debate today. Mary was now a widow, Queen Dowager, and her eldest son finally became King Edward VIII. But instead of stability, his accession unleashed the greatest crisis of her life. Edward was deeply involved with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had already been divorced once and was still married to her second husband when their affair began. For a British king in the 1930s, this wasn't just a romantic problem, it was a political and religious nightmare. The government made it clear Edward could not marry Wallis and remain king. The Church of England, of which he was head, frowned on remarriage after divorce. Many in the establishment saw Wallis as completely unacceptable as queen. Mary watched the crisis unfold with a mixture of disbelief and quiet dread. She received updates, listened to ministers, and even tried behind the scenes to block Wallis's divorce from her second husband, hoping that if Wallis couldn't legally marry Edward, the relationship might fade away. What she didn't do was confront her son early and directly. The emotional distance that had always existed between them now had consequences. By the time she sat Edward down for tea and begged him to think of his younger brother Albert, who had not been raised or prepared to be king, it was too late. Edward was determined. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII gave a radio address announcing his abdication, stepping down for the woman I love. Albert became King George VI, the shy, stammering man thrust into a role he'd never expected. Mary was heartbroken, not only at her son's choice, but at the damage done to the institution she'd spent her life protecting. Yet she did what she always did. She adjusted. She stood firmly behind her new king, supported her daughter-in-law, and shifted fully into her role as the elder stateswoman of the royal family. The monarchy had survived one more crisis, but another, even greater, was already on the horizon. World War II brought fresh terror. Bombs fell on London. Children were evacuated. The elderly and vulnerable were urged to leave the city. Mary spent much of the war at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, but she didn't retire into quiet comfort. She visited hospitals, met evacuees, and kept her hands busy knitting an elaborate carpet that was later sold for a large sum and donated to the government to help pay for the war's crushing costs. When the war finally ended in 1945, Mary was in her late 70s. She had lived through 2 global conflicts, the fall of multiple monarchies, the rise of communism and fascism, and a Britain that was no longer the unquestioned ruler of a world empire. She watched the empire begin to dissolve. In 1947, India, where she had once stood crowned as empress, gained independence, splitting into India and Pakistan amid horrific religious violence. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements grew stronger. At home, a new labor government swept into power, promising a welfare state, a national health service, and a more equal society. Mary distrusted these changes. She wasn't opposed to helping the poor, far from it. She simply believed that charity and private effort, not the state, should lead that mission. It was an old-world view colliding with a new-world reality. Personal sorrow continued to shadow her. She had buried Prince John in 1919. In 1942, her son George, Duke of Kent, died in a plane crash. Then, in 1952, her second son, the shy, stammering boy who had become King George VI, died of illness at just 56. Mary, frail but still fierce in spirit, was among the first to kiss the hand of his daughter and acknowledge her as Queen Elizabeth II. She lived long enough to see the dawn of a new reign, but not its great ceremony. As plans were being laid for Elizabeth's coronation on June 2, 1953, Mary's health collapsed. She suffered from stomach problems and, as later revealed, lung cancer. By early 1953, she was largely confined to her bed, sensitive to light and drained of energy. On March 24, 1953, she suffered a hemorrhage and died later that night at Marlborough House, aged 85. Churchill called her passing the end of the last living link to the days of Queen Victoria. Today, her name lives on around the world, in colleges like Queen Mary University of London, which was named in her honor, and Queen Mary College in Lahore, Pakistan. She appears in books, films, and series, as the strict but steady presence in the King's Speech, as a complex figure in The Crown, and in stories about the shy boy Prince John, the abdication crisis, and the royal family's survival through the 20th century. But behind all the pageantry and polished portraits, Mary of Teck's true legacy is something quieter, and maybe more powerful. She didn't lead armies, she didn't write laws, she rarely raised her voice, but she helped design the image of the modern British monarchy, a royal family that presents itself not as iron-fisted rulers, but as symbols of continuity, charity, and national identity. She was the woman who held a strict, often cold household together, yet also the one her children turned to for softness, the queen who inspired genuine affection in ordinary people, yet whose hunger for collecting has led some to accuse her of crossing lines. The matriarch who saw empire at its peak and lived long enough to watch that empire unravel. Without Mary of Teck, the House of Windsor might not have survived the storms of the 20th century. She didn't just wear the crown's jewels. In many ways, she helped hold the crown in place. So, what do you think of Mary of Teck? Was she a strong, respectable matriarch who did what she had to do to protect the monarchy, or do the stories of her obsessive collecting and emotional distance change how you see her? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Ancient Exposé, where the past is never really past. It's just waiting to be uncovered.